psychometric assessment. So, my pleasure.
I'm delighted and honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today. And I just thank Linda in Malay, which I'm sure all of you understand, as well as I understand Spanish, actually. And I know how to use this really well, as you can tell. Okay. One more time. Okay. I'm going to talk about something Hans Eysenck talked about a great deal, which is the integration of experimental psychology and correlational psychology. And this is to be a broad theme of the talk, and also a discussion of the two disciplines of psychology, and also just the general contributions of Hans Eysenck to the field. I'm partly known as a fairly strong critic of Hans's work, but I really like the tradition of working in a paradigmatic study where you could, in fact, debate theory with fellow theoreticians. I will, probably halfway through, talk about the process of theory testing, and I'll go through, surprisingly enough, lots of examples of my own work testing theory, and how the process of doing theory, and then conclude with new techniques we have. Now, Linda and I both spent 2 years way over there with the A. Actually, she was right next door. She was over there, 500 miles away. This is where I first learned about Hans Eysenck, and I'll explain that in a minute. This is where I was living for 2 years. And you don't somehow associate Hans Eysenck and psychology with a building like this. You don't associate it with upriver jungles of Borneo. However, it turns out the only books about psychology in the local bookstore, when I say local, I mean 100 kilometers downriver, 10 hours by Chinese launch, but it was the local bookstore. The only books on psychology there were these 3 wonderful paperbacks: Fact and Fiction, Sense and Nonsense, and Uses and Abuses in Psychology. And if you haven't read them, I recommend reading them. These were revolutionary books in the 50s and early 60s, suggesting that psychology, and particularly personality, had something to offer to everybody. And I devoured these books, and mosquitoes devoured me at the same time. And at the back, the lights, if we could dim these lights a little bit somehow, because these slides aren't going to come through. Hans looked much younger in these pictures than he did for many of our recollections of him. But reading those, I then sat home and got hard copy editions of things like The Dimensions of Personality and The Scientific Structure of Human Personality. These were sent from Cambridge, United States, to Borneo. It took about 6 months to get there. My copies of these still have mosquitoes squished in between the pages to remind me of how fun it was to read serious scientific work. I came back to the United States having read down to about here. Obviously, I hadn't read the 67 book. It was just come out. Saying, this is really cool stuff. I want to be a personality psychologist. Until then, I was basically part mathematician and part social psychologist. And I discovered this field of personality is a science. And this is a science where mathematicians can have a good time. And that was very exciting. And where we can actually do serious science. Now, what most people today don't remember, although Randy Larson and I were talking about this earlier, there was a period in American psychology from about 1968, when I started graduate school, it turns out, to about 1990 that I refer to as the dark ages of personality in the United States. Personality was bogus. Personality didn't exist. Why would one want to study personality? It was a stupid thing to study. I just read all these books by Hans Eysenck that told me personality was really exciting and had biological bases to it and could relate to cognitive psychology, could relate to experimental psychology. So it was very strange to read some of this work. These scars still persist. I mean, Randy and I were discussing this. A whole generation of graduate students who didn't get jobs in the 70s and 80s because they studied personality. And that, some of us still get upset with our social friends. However, Europeans were not taken in by this nonsense. Europeans continued, and with exceptions in the States, Marv Zuckerman was an exception in the States, Europeans studied personality, and they just kept on going. They didn't stop. And so whenever I talk to this group or groups like this in Europe, I always want to give my thanks as an American personality psychologist to the world of psychology who didn't die. And whether we agree with Hans or not, and I didn't actually, we owe a great deal to his contributions to the field because he kept the field going and he kept pressing the best science. I'm going to try to do two themes. One is the whole theme of the two disciplines of psychology, and the other is how to do, and these are taken from Hans, the other is the process of theory construction and validation. And I'm going to emphasize, because I do admit I'm a psychometrician at heart, for some of the time, I will emphasize it's possible to integrate personality and psychometrics with experimental procedures. And the two disciplines, as some of you might know, C.P. Snow talked about two intellectual disciplines, the humanists versus the scientists. So these were the two cultures. And this was very much of academic in Cambridge. This was not the two cultures of the broader UK. This was the two cultures of academics in Cambridge who were basically physicists and writers. And they talked a different language. And Snow makes this point that although he'd go from the daytime working in the lab to the evening drinking with his writer friends, and it was like going to a different country, a different culture. Although they came from clearly the same race, the same social origins, same incomes, but they thought about the world differently. Now in psychology, we also have that. Gregory Kimball made the same point, that we have these two broad approaches to the broad field of basically humanists versus scientific approach to psychology. Then within that narrow aspect of those of us who are scientific psychologists, you get two more disciplines. This is what I will talk about today. Hans and also Lee Cronbach both talked about the two, I would call them tribes practically, the two cultures, the two disciplines here of the research correlationalists versus the experimentalists. And Cronbach tried multiple times to integrate these two. Hans tried multiple times to integrate the two. We wrote a review a couple of years ago saying it's still an issue that we should talk about, and we're still not integrated, but this group is closest to any group that does it. I want to talk about the problems of this integration. Now, partly, this is a sort of traditional way of looking at the problem. Traditional way as well, correlationalists, we trace back to Galton. If you haven't read Galton, you really should. It's just an amazing, it's on the web, of course, and you can waste hours reading Galton. It's just a delight to read 1870 work by Galton. Pearson is not so much fun to read. Spearman is sort of a mix in terms of readability. But generally, our founders are different. I mean, Wundt, Gossett, and of course, also published as Student, and Fisher are the real founders of experimental psychology, and they have a very different approach to the field. This is the standard, we use R and phi and Yule's Q and multivariate R and factor analysis and principal components. They use bivariate T and F and multivariate MANOVA. We, of course, are all sophisticated, and we realize it's all the same general linear model. We try to use statistical control. They use experimental control. The question is, why don't we get along better? And partly it's because both sides are naive about how hard the other side is. That we sort of say, well, we have personality. We'll study all the complex dimensions of personality and ability. They have tasks. Just choose any task. They have very complicated models of tasks. And they say, well, we'll study personality. What does that mean, they'll study personality? Because think about the problems facing the experimentalist who wants to study personality. Does this person study the giant 3, the big 5, beyond the big 5? In terms of these are just the inventories you can give. The constructs, could they do any of the big 5, the giant 2 or 3 or 5? Or do you want to get honesty, humility, impulsivity, sociability? There are all kinds of variables they could study. If they come to us, we don't just say, it's complicated what we're telling them to go study, but then we talk to them. We say, I want to study something, some cognitive task. Oh, great. I want to study memory. Cool. Do you want to study working memory? How about iconic memory, or short-term memory, or long-term memory, or semantic memory, or episodic memory, or procedural memory? These are all different. And each lab in your department studies a different aspect of those memory systems. Autobiographical memory, false memory, recall, recognition. Which one do you want to study? Oh, I'll study attention. I've published on attention. Donald Broadbent suggested we should not use the word attention because there's so many meanings of the word attention. Do you want to study sustained attention? Do you want to study the allocation of attention? How to capture attention? The breadth of attention, local global distinctions, paying attention, staying awake before coffee. These are important things to do. Well, how about analysis? Well, the poor experimentalist who comes to us, we say, oh, you should do an EFA or a CFA or principal components, and I apologize for taking someone apart yesterday about the distinction. I'd had too much caffeine before the talk. But there is a major distinction between principal components and factor analysis, and we shouldn't confuse it. Should we do path analysis? Should we do a structural equation analysis? Should we do latent growth curve analysis? Do you want to do internal consistency? If you want to do internal consistency, do you want to look at reliability? Do you want to look at alternative forms? Do you want to do test-retest? Do we want to do item response theory? At this point, our experimental friend runs away from our labs, from our classes. And says, I cannot do this. This is much too complicated. Then we tell them, oh, do you want to do a Pearson R or a Spearman Phi or a Spearman Rho or a Phi or a Yule Q or a tetrachoric? Or why not do a polychoric? Or how about what kind of Goodnessoffit statistic do you want? And we heard just a few minutes ago about what reliability statistics should you have. Should you use alpha? Should you use beta? Should you use omega H? Should you use omega T? These are all different. Once again, our experimentalist is confused, but they make up for it because they say, oh, well, I want to study reaction time. Cool. You want to study something? Well, which paradigm do you want to use? Do you want to use Sternberg's scanning task for looking at working memory, looking at speed? Do you want to do a Radcliffe choice task? How about Larry Jacoby's identification task? Each one is a very delicately different task. Do you want to look at accuracy, serial anticipation on a memory task, free recall, cued recognition? What about attention? You want to study attention? Well, there's the Posner task. Well, the Posner task is different from the Erickson flanker task, which is different from a vigilance task, which is different from the dot probe task or the Stroop task, or the emotional Stroop task, or eye tracking. Eye tracking is really exciting, but eye tracking has an incredible set of complexities if you do eye tracking studies. I have students who've done that, and it's just horrendous. Reaction time. Then they ask you, what phosphor was on your screen? How fast did it decay? All these things you don't want to know about, actually, but they do. And they will say, and how far was the eye from the screen? And did they use a bite bar? This is much more complicated than, oh, we'll just give them the task. We worry about item wording, responses, alternatives, appropriate sample size, subject selection. Who were the people who came into our lab? How do we generalize our characteristics? They worry about number of practice trials. So some of us give very few practice trials. It turns out in a good attention task, you need hundreds of practice trials before you start collecting data. They talk about ISIs, which means interstimulus interval, or stimulus onset asynchrony, which is subtly different. And type of randomization. Do you do counterbalancing? Do you block randomization? How do you do data trim? Then, of course, many people who do experiments, we worry about their data in terms of their p-hacking. Did they actually find what they thought they found? Or did they convince themselves it was there because they had such low power, because they ran so few subjects, that they only report the things that had 0.5 level of significance, which will never be replicated, it turns out. It's a very interesting problem. Separate from that is the process of doing science. And how do we, and this is a slide on the right-hand side is taken directly from Hans. Going from science, from hunch to hypothesis to theory to law. And the notion of we do observations. We're constantly scientists. Earlier today, Brian Little was talking about George Kelly, who said we're all scientists. We're all having hunches and hypotheses about the world. We collect data. We have hypotheses we generate from our data. We also have hypothesis tests. and we have levels of theory. I was quite proud at one point when it was quite clear that I was a confusion to Hans's theory. He said, well, you have theories and there's some things that are not quite right, and I had moved up to the not quite right part. It was very exciting. Do we have weak theories or do we have strong theories? Weak theories are where you're doing mainly confirmation studies. Strong theories where maybe you can actually do disconfirmation studies. There are very few laws, unfortunately, in our field. Hans also had I've been reading, I think, recently, as you can tell, talked about the process of doing science, and he quoted from this serious philosopher about the process of doing science is hard, as we all know. And it's not just the simple textbook, oh, do disconfirmation and move on. It's much more complicated, and we all know how to do it. But we have to ask ourselves critical questions. Are we learning things as we're moving on? Are we asking ourselves insights? Now, Eysenck worked a great deal building a paradigm, and he really welcomed people working in that paradigm, and he welcomed critiques of that paradigm. And so, for instance, he gave his presidential address to the first meeting of this group, that lovely picture in London we had. He gave a long discussion about the process of anomalies. There should be no bar to the acceptance of the paradigm. The existence of such anomalies should merely act as a spur for the puzzle-solving capacities of ordinary science. And he spent half an hour attacking Jeffrey Gray's attack on him. And then he said, I am so happy that Jeffrey's replacing me at the Maudsley. I mean, it was really, that's the way science should be. Your best critics are your best friends are your harshest critics, which is something we tell our graduate students the first day of graduate school, because we take them apart asking them questions because we're trying to help them get better. But I mean, he just really liked Jeffrey Gray's work, even though it was definitely critical of Hans's work. Hans also changed his theory a great deal. He didn't really talk about how he changed it. You have to go back and read the theory of the 47s and the 50s and the 60s and the 80s and the 90s, and you discover it's a completely different theory every time. Some of the pictures looked the same, but what went in the boxes were different. What he tried to do was integrate personality with the best current experimental psychology at the time. In the 40s, that was Haldian learning theory. In the 50s, that was much more Hebb and Berline and Broadbent's work in arousal. In the 70s, 60s and 70s, it became genetics. And he said before he died, if he were a young man, he'd study biochemistry and much more molecular biology, because that was the way to go. Always take your theories and push it against the best theories we have in the field. Well, I first came across his work when he was looking at the Hebb studies, looking at why people perform efficiently or inefficiently under stress. This is the notion that we should study things that make a difference. And the Hebb curve came out of studies of human performance with soldiers and pilots. Pilots don't fly well if they're very sound asleep. Soldiers don't fight well if they're being shot at, it turns out. That can you study this as in the lab with personality differences? And of course, he proposed that there was a difference between introverts and extroverts, such that introverts acted as if they were more aroused. And it's a lovely theory. It's too bad I don't think it's right. But it's a lovely theory of explaining, and that doesn't work because the mic's in my pocket. Impulsivity is one of my strong suits. Don't think that's why I've studied it. The notion was simply that a level of arousal function, we know the slide, I don't need to talk about it, that basically, can you test it? And we did test it in a nice paper in the 76 where we tested this model, and we said, well, if introverts are more aroused than extroverts, and if performance is a curvilinear function of arousal, and if caffeine makes you more aroused, then we would expect introverts to do well in relaxed conditions and extroverts to do well in stress conditions. And it was exciting enough that science thought it was a reasonable thing to publish. It was a nice crossover interaction. And that was very exciting for a young assistant professor to get an article in Science, and Eysenck liked it because, after all, it was supported his theory. The day that article came out, my student Kirby Gilliland came in with dissertation data, failing to replicate the study. That's very frightening for an assistant. It should be frightening to anybody if you can't replicate your own work. It's particularly frightening to an assistant professor if you can't replicate your own work. Kirby did a better study than I had done. Kirby used 3 levels of caffeine instead of just 2 levels of caffeine. We used the new and improved Eysenck personality questionnaire. We didn't get the same results. We did get the same results because by accident we happened to have the EPI on some of the subjects. On the new and improved Eysenck personality questionnaire, we did not find the results. We found that introverts came up and got worse, but extroverts got worse and then got better, completely against what we expected. When we went back to the earlier test, we got exactly what we expected. Introverts got better, then got worse. You should increase the stress. That's exactly the inverted U you'd like. And the extroverts just got better. If you go back several slides, that's exactly what you'd expect. How wonderful. Why did it not work on the new and improved test? And this is why experimentalists need to be psychometricians at the same time. So this is playing both sides of this. Because it turns out, psychometrically, the EPQ is a much better test than the EPI. It turns out that the correlations of the scales, extroversion across the 2 scales, is quite high for both of them. But the factor structure of the E scale and the EPI is 2 dimensions, what's called impulsivity and sociability. The EPQ was a much better psychometric scale. It just measured one thing, sociability. They've thrown out the bathwater. They threw out the baby, actually, which was impulsivity. And Tom Rockland and I, developed a statistical technique to demonstrate this effect and then pointed this out. And for a while, there was a small sort of cottage industry of people going back and reanalyzing their data in terms of impulsivity versus sociability, finding their results were, in fact, not extroversion results, but sociability results. So this is where psychometrics goes together with experimental psychology. Then we continued to fail to replicate ourselves. We could replicate ourselves about half the time. I was working with Mike Humphreys on this at this point, and it was the most frustrating 3 years. Half the studies worked perfectly, half the studies didn't work at all. If anything, they had the opposite result. We were working on the assumption that extroverts are less aroused than introverts, and we assumed that, we were assuming this. We assumed that you're less aroused in the morning than the afternoon. We assumed that you're less aroused with placebo than caffeine. After quite a long time, we discovered something different. In the morning, when we organized our data by time of day, every study we did in the morning had the same result we predicted. Introverts got worse, extroverts low impulsives got worse, high impulsives got better. Every study we did in the evening had the opposite result. That's great, once you find it out, but it was a long 3 years, because what this led us to think about is the limitations of the model, and also led us to strongly critique Hans's theory of introverts are always more aroused. No, they're not. They're always more aroused if you run them in the morning. They're not more aroused if you run them in the evening. Introverts are not wide awake people in the evening. You can take experimental data and do correlations on it. A friend of mine at another university in the Chicago area had done many experiments in which she was looking at body temperature. And she recorded core body temperature, which is to say you put a rectal probe in and the subjects walk around for a week. And I don't want to take any credit for collecting these data at all. However, she did these little 20-person studies doing experimental shift work studies, but she gave MMPIs to all her subjects. 20 subjects here, 20 subjects there. Pretty soon you have 180 or so subjects, and you can do individual differences work. We happened to share, she had a research assistant who became a graduate student of mine, Erin Baer, and if you organize this not by impulsivity, but by morningness, eveningness, you find a lovely result of individual differences collected by experimental psychologists that you can organize as individual differences psychologists into a very systematic pattern. And I like to refer to this as biology meets society because there's a bigger difference in the diurnal rhythms of morning versus evening people than there is at what time they go to bed or what time they get up. Morning people stay up too late at night, and night people go to bed earlier than they really want. But night people are really sound asleep when they wake up in the morning. They get up earlier than they want because society happens that way. They get up later, but they don't get up as much later as they'd like. This leads to the notion of theory testing. How do you do theory testing? And there are a number of theories of human performance. I emphasize human performance because we wanted to show personality was important. Because this was the 70s and 80s, personality was bogus. We said, no, it's not bogus. It predicts really important things. This is before Brent Roberts did his wonderful meta-analysis showing it predicts all kinds of nice things, or Ian Deary showed personality predicts how long you live. This was just short-term cognitive tasks, trying to convince cognitive psychologists they should put in personality. There were at least three, I have four, so I'll say there were at least three models of how motivation affects human performance. There was Eysenck's notion of arousal, Jack Atkinson's work on achievement motivation. There were these theories of anxiety and cognitive performance. Being anxious is not necessarily good. There was a theory of the Yerkes-Dodson law, quote law, of inverted U, and Easterbrook with a model for it. Mike and I tried organizing that in trying to organize these multiple theories into one testable theory. And we like to think of this as a very simple model. And I say that in great big quotes. We looked at three broad dimensions of personality. These are the ones from the theorists we knew about: introversion, extroversion, / impulsivity, anxiety, and achievement motivation. The achievement motivation literature and the anxiety and the extroversion literature both looked at human performance. Both of these were good researchers, Jack Atkinson and Hans Eysenck. Both of them wrote faster than they could read, much faster than I can read, and they never read each other. And so I knew them both, and I knew they both did not know about the other's work. It was very intriguing. What we tried to do is integrate the two. We tried to look at attention tasks, and we did decompose it, or performance tasks. We did decompose performance tasks into attention and working memory tasks. Instead of complex tasks, it's actually both. Here's our simple model that put it together, trying to, and it's conceptually a latent variable model, and you could add boxes to make it what looks like a path model. I should point out in the process of science and theory, I had a colleague, Ben Underwood, and another colleague, Don Campbell, who talked about whether you should have latent variables or not. Ben Underwood looked at this figure and said, this is very nice, Bill, but why would anyone want to think that way? Why would anyone want to have latent variables? Well, this group, I think, thinks latent variables are useful to think about. But we were trying to organize all of this. At the same time, we were trying to test it out. Theories are not right or wrong. Theories are better or worse. We spent a number of years working on this paradigm, that if you have a number of phenomena, let's call them A through F, some theories make predictions for some of the phenomena, some make the same prediction of the same. So for instance, phenomena A, all theories say, yeah, that should happen. Phenomena B, two theories say something should happen, one theory says nothing about it, and one says it should happen. Don't do those. Study this one. This one's a good one. This theory says this should happen. This other theory says this should happen the other way. That's the one you want to do. A third theory says, well, it should be zero effect, and a fourth theory doesn't talk about it. So we did a number of studies that had that basic paradigm. Theories of anxiety and conditioning, and models of conditioning, my former student and now long-term colleague, Rick Zinbarg. How do people learn things? Well, there's drive theory, there's Eysenck's learning theory, there's Jeffrey Gray's impulsivity and cue utilizations. How can you integrate these two? And I'm not going to go through the details of this. And there's also Newman's work on reward sensitivity. You can do a nice no-go, go, no-go, reinforcement, not reinforcement task. and get nice interactions as predicted. Not quite as predicted because unfortunately real data are never as nice as you like them to be. That's life. It turns out these data actually were better. I think Philip Cora said that the data actually supported the new and improved Eysenck. I knew an improved gray, not the original gray. We didn't, of course, know that at the time. We also looked at theories of anxiety and performance. There are 3 theories of anxiety. Once again, I say 4. Although the title of the article talks about 3, so I'm sort of stuck with that. There are alternative models of anxiety and human performance. There's the classic notion of Hall, Spence. Everyone knows that anxious people don't do well on hard tasks. They do well on easy tasks. That's completely demolished by the work of Bernie Weiner. There's also the work that anxiety, this is Mike Eysenck's work, that anxiety reduces the amount of working memory. And there's also Easterbrook's hypothesis that it narrows the breadth of attention. Then there's a really simple model, which I really don't like, but it's probably right, which is anxiety takes your mind off the task. If you're anxious, you don't focus on our task, you focus on your task. As as researchers, our subjects' primary goal is not to make us happy, it's to keep their self-esteem. So if we're giving them failure feedback, they don't work hard on our task, they think about themselves. And so it turns out that anxiety leads to off-task thoughts. We tested this. You can make up nice geometric analogies on the fly. These are nice. You can get nice reaction time differences by this. And you can show very nice effects of JPSP liked it, let me put it that way. Nice effects. One thing we did find in this study, anxious people, if the task is really hard, they stop playing your game. They just want to leave the room. They just press the button as fast as they can to get out of the room. Anxious people's behavior actually doesn't follow these nice models at all levels. We can also test theories by looking at failures to get effects. And who is better able to test your theory than yourself? And so Chris Anderson and I did a number of studies and we came up with a nice hypothesis. We looked at sustained attention. We examined sustained attention at 2 different times. We did a memory scanning task. Looked at time of day, and we found a time of day of impulsivity interaction we did not predict. And pressing the right button would really help. Science goes by disconfirmation. It's really nice to be able to say that your theory is so good that you know you showed it was wrong. And it's better you should show it's wrong than someone else. Well, we in fact did say that the data obviously contradict our own previous theory. To me, that's good science. If you can have a theory good enough that you can show it's wrong, you're making progress. I actually learned that trick from Donald Broadbent, who took great pride in saying, contrary to previous work, Broadbent, we now show something else. As experimentalists and individual differences, we can also integrate our work. So for about 10 years, we collected data in every study we did. We gave people a mood questionnaire, asking them, and Randy, we had some of your words, of course, in this. A questionnaire, 72 items, exactly fits on 1 page if you use type font 10. That was the limit of how many items we were going to give. We took items from Bob Thayer's work. We took items from Clark and Watson's work and Tulligan, and also from Larson and Diener. We collected 100 people here, 200 people there. Eshkol, Raffaelli, and I eventually put those together, and we had, by that time, 3,800 subjects. No experimentalist runs 3,800 subjects. Most correlationalists don't run 3,800 subjects. Keep your data. Collect it. You can later analyze it in your own meta-analyses from your own lab. And I believe in open source software, and so in fact, this data set, A, we published it, and B, the data set's available in the Psych package. So if you want to look at how the structure of 72 words measuring basically energetic arousal versus tense arousal, you can find the structure, and if you do it yourself, you can have bigger print, such that you can actually see what the words are. Basically, showing that the dimensions of affect can basically be broken down into energetic arousal and tense arousal, a la Bob Thayer. The positive and negative affect dimensions are not quite as simple, but you can look at all of his data. But the advantage is, as an experimentalist, collect the data as a correlationalist, a psychometrician, put it together. Now, recent discussions of replicability, and this is sweeping both Europe, there have been many, the European Journal has a discussion of replicability. Recent issues of APS, and the APS has had discussions of replicability, have tried to say you shouldn't have small samples because you're p-hacking and the like. I like to point out that I probably published the fewest subjects ever in the Journal of Personality in the personality section, because we had 8 subjects. We actually had 4 when we first submitted it, but the reviewers said, you can't publish 4 subjects in the personality section of JPSP. So we wrote back and said, okay, we've doubled our sample size. Now we have 8. It was a thought experiment, basically saying that Schwader and Dondrati's notion that personality was bogus was a stupid study. As a thought experiment, we made the mistake of collecting data. We could have published it with no subjects, probably. Basically, and Peter Borkenau did the same study, but he used real subjects, and it took him much longer and similar results. You also don't need to have significance when you do studies. Luke Smiley was visiting a couple of years after the Issid meeting 4 years ago, in fact, and we had a long talk about how you can make people extroverted and what's extroversion and positive affect, how do they go together. And we talked about the Larson Effect, which no one had called the Larson Effect until we did, and Randy loves this slide because to have a Larson Effect there. We had a result, which we hadn't published, because we had absolutely a 0 result. No result, no effect at all of extroversion and positive affect induction by using movies. However, combining that study with no results, Bayes factor of 1,000, this is to say it was really a flat line. Combining that with studies that Luke did, you could show that in fact we had much better understanding of the relationship of positive affect and extroversion. Extroverts really like to do things where they get reward, where they get the reward. They don't care about just getting rewards without doing the thing. So not only do I have a study in JPSP with almost no subjects, I have a study in JPSP with no result. So cheer up. It's possible to get all kinds of things published even though they don't look right the first time. Now, correlation is not limited to psychologists. There are a number of other sciences that use correlational observational techniques. We call them astronomy. How many experiments do we do in astronomy? Not many. Geology, oceanography, climatology. It's been claimed we're actually doing an experiment, but there's no control planet. By putting CO2 into the atmosphere, we are doing a grand experiment on the planet, but there's no control groups. I'm not going to count that as an experiment. Part of the trick we should learn from these other correlational sciences is we should learn that what they have done is they get better measurements. The breakthroughs really happen when they get better measurements. Galileo developed an 8-power telescope. Eventually got it up to 16, spent most of his next couple of years making telescopes so people could replicate his work. And the heliocentric theory came from this. Darwin and Russell had a great new instrument. It was called the ship. They went out and collected data in far remote spots of the world and came home and thought about it. In oceanography, the echo sounder changed the way we thought about the oceans. We used to think of the ocean as flat on the bottom. With the echo sounder, this is pre-satellites, they discovered mountains, they discovered ridges, they discovered trenches. That it just changed the way they thought about oceanography. In climate science, good data collection has led to thinking about changes in carbon dioxide. The correlational sciences progress by good measurement and good technique. So do the correlational work in personality, individual differences. Galton, Spearman, and Thurstone, the development and the study of cognitive ability, and Galton and Spearman measured cognitive ability. Galton, Pearson, and Spearman developed the correlation coefficient, a great breakthrough. All of psychometrics is a footnote on Galton and Spearman. I mean, everything we've done since then is just getting better at that stuff. Spearman and Thurston developed factor analysis. Structural equation modeling is just a generalization. And Spearman published in The same year he published about general intelligence. He also published in the correlation coefficient. He also discovered factor analysis. It's a great year as a graduate student, 2 publications like that. Generalizations of factor analysis we now call structural equation modeling. An even bigger generalization of that is longitudinal structural equation modeling. And we now have the capability, and it's a great capability we all should learn how to use, multi-level modeling within and between individual effects. This allows us as personality psychologists, individual difference psychologists, to study the process of behavior within the individual over time, and we have the ability to do it. Improvements in measurement have also happened. We heard earlier today about a 40-year longitudinal study of children at age 12, starting at age 12, going up to age 51, looking at how childhood conscientiousness predicts long-term performance. We have notions of a lot of longitudinal studies are now bearing fruit. Of course, the Terman study started in the 1920s, has come out with really nice results over the years. Jack Block's longitudinal studies. Ian Deary, as we heard 2 days ago, went to his basement and had a longitudinal study in the basement in Edinburgh. It's more complicated than that, I suspect. Sarah Hampson and Lou Goldberg have gone back to take data collected by Jack Digman and have now done a 40-year longitudinal study of 50-year longitudinal study of personality. These are great ways to collect other people's data and use it. Also, technologies have been developed recently. This is the big ear. This is, the big ear is actually a little ear. It's something you can put on your waist, and every 13 minutes or so, it randomly samples 30 seconds of your speech. This is illegal in Illinois, but it's legal in Missouri. You have to choose your laws carefully when you do this. It's probably illegal in Germany, I suspect, too. But that it's recording surreptitiously your acoustic environment. It can test out whether, in fact, do males talk more than females or vice versa? The answer is no. And what do people talk about? Do they sing in the shower? It gets all this kind of nice result. You can also use cell phones. Most subjects have one of these. You can text message your subjects and collect data. You don't need to give them a Palm Pilot anymore. People have cell phones. Use cell phones to collect within subject data. Josh Wilt and David Condon and I have talked about the ability to do what we call telemetrics. Other people have talked about telemetrics. You can get large samples using the web. We're not limited to 200 people or 50 people or 8 people to a study. We routinely report 20,000 to 30,000 subjects in a study. It's possible to do this. Other techniques that people have been developing, the twin and family studies. Twin family, by the way, is a cool design. You can look at the children of identical twins. They are biologically half-sibs, but they are environmentally cousins. It's an interesting genetic design. Twin studies are, of course, an experiment done not by us. It's randomization of nature. It's a wonderful study. Imaging studies, MRI, fMRI, PET, MEG. Colin, for instance, has done this a lot. We've also heard talks, and I talk about genome-wide association. It might not be as promising as we think. I mean, I've heard enough talks about people saying, well, GWAS is really cool, but I'm not finding anything, so I'm not going to push that. Something else we can learn from the observational sciences, like climate change is a nice example, is modeling and the power of modeling. That you can't do experiments on climate, but you can do experiments on your model of the climate to see how sensitive the model is to various parameter shifts. And you can, in fact, work out what's the important variables to look at in your climate model as you do experiments on your simulations. So now we can do that, and so this you get the sensitivity of the parameter values. We can do that with our models of personality. There are models that I talked about this morning, for instance, looking at the dynamics of action of Jack Atkinson and our reparameterization. You can test that out, say what are the parameters that are sensitive in this model that make this model give you reasonable results versus stupid results. This is the experiments not on data, but experiments on models of data. So my conclusion to all this is personality and individual differences have become much more exciting over the last 40 years. It was exciting then, it's even more exciting now. More people are using more ways to study more problems than ever before. The fact that we have the number of people we've had in this meeting is very exciting. If you compare that to the number of people who showed up at the London meeting, and we could take a picture of us. It wasn't very hard to take a picture of the 40 or 50 of us. Now we have several hundred people. It's very, very exciting. We can think beyond the experimental and correlational. We need to think the power of the interactions, the power of developing theory has made us a stronger science. I mean, I critiqued Eysenck a lot in my career, but I followed in a paradigmatic line so you can test theory. Theory happens not by one-off studies. Theory happens by systematic sets of studies. And I think I just pressed the wrong button, so I'll do this. And I'd like to conclude saying we all owe a great deal of debt to Hans Eysenck for developing theory, which has made us as theorists better theorists and better able to understand personality and individual differences. Thank you.